When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be. Paul, who by his own description of himself came late to Christianity, even though he was probably no older than the apostles who made up the original 12, but he discovered that he had a unique calling. At some point, after his dramatic conversion experience and sometime in the wilderness preparing himself for a new ministry and going out to begin to spread the good news of Jesus Christ, he met up with the original followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, and there was a clash. Paul sensed that his calling was to travel the Roman roads and visit the cities of trade around the Mediterranean world and create new communities of Christians. The original apostles, now led by James, felt that their work remained in the holy city of Jerusalem. Peter was caught somewhere in the middle of the issue of whether or not their work was to continue that their work was to continue to convert Jews or to include Gentiles. And if Gentiles were to be accepted into the new community, then what rules were they to follow regarding eating and circumcision? Paul was more of a come on down kind of guy when it came to those kinds of rules, although he had plenty of opinions about the general behavior of Christians. And although Paul's mission was to create new communities, he understood that they were still all part of the same network. that they all needed to be connected, not only through the story of Jesus Christ, with the Eucharist, with the ministry to the poor among them, but also with the church in Jerusalem and the work of the church in Jerusalem. He brought this up specifically in a few of his letters, that he was taking up a collection that would be sent back to Jerusalem to support the people in need there. Now, Paul called all Christian people saints. The term was not reserved for martyrs or for especially holy people, but rather he used it for everyone who was in communion and community with one another through the love and grace that flowed from the resurrected Jesus, Lord Christ. Our epistle reading today actually is about that collection, although you have to go back a few verses from our text to understand this. He seemed to be issuing something of a challenge to the Corinthians. He had pointed out that the Macedonians, that is the folks in Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, who were not very well off, were nonetheless very generous in their giving to the collection for the Jerusalem saints. So, as our reading today starts out, perhaps he suggests the Corinthians who excel at so much should excel in their giving too. Scholarship is sketchy about how this all worked out and whether the collection was even delivered. But the point is that Paul felt that in addition to his teachings about Jesus and worship and Eucharist and how to live together as a community, financial support was also an important aspect of Christian life. Why did he do it? Maybe the church in Jerusalem needed new flooring. Maybe the saints in Jerusalem needed funds to stock their food pantry. Maybe the saints in Corinth needed to do some more to demonstrate their understanding of how the saints near and far are connected to the things that happened in Jerusalem, that is, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Maybe Paul wanted to do something to stay part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, even though he had broken with almost all of the other apostles. Who knows? I just find it interesting that the usual conversations about Paul and his ministry tend to overlook this facet of his work. He asked for money, not time, talent, and treasure, but cold, hard cash to provide for the poor and to support the church. Well, we don't like to talk about money at church, do we? We point to Jesus and say, he didn't say much about money, other than something a little ambiguous about taxation, and that story about finding a coin in a fish's mouth to pay the temple tax. He may or may not have been dissing the temple system by noting that a poor widow put everything she had into the treasury. And you know the part about not being able to serve both God and wealth. Jesus seemed to approach the topic of money in a more oblique way, and we tend to hear his pronouncements as hyperbole anyway, and maybe not connected to supporting the work of ministry. But the gospel writer Luke says very plainly that it was a group of women who were the providers for Jesus' ministry. They gave from what they had to support his mission. They were patrons as well as disciples. And that patronage meant that Jesus was free to go about his business of healing the sick and raising the dead, bringing new life to both the old and the young, revealing the kingdom of God as a place where love is the way and that there is always more than enough. ministering to those on the margins, and challenging those with means to use those means to provide for those without, which is what those women did for Jesus. The word patron is a little old-fashioned. It's more often associated with royalty, or with the rich people whose names are printed in the playbill as members of the Gold Circle or the Silver Circle, who support the symphony or the museum, more than the modern day church. We don't use that word so much here. I myself tend to emphasize that our giving to the church is an investment in the mission and ministry of this place, which I believe is true. But I also believe that that old-fashioned sense of being a patron carries with it the idea of responsibility. Making an investment is a choice, a very good choice. But a responsibility is more than a choice. Patronage is responsibility that is simply part of one's identity. As Christians, we are, like those women in the Gospel of Luke, called to be patrons of ministry. And maybe we need a little reminder every now and then, from time to time, or even a challenge to consider the question of balance between our own abundance and the needs of the saints far and near, and a challenge to respond with eagerness, because it's simply what we do. We are patrons of ministry.